what if the absolute best way to become incredibly effective or lead a massive organization or even save the environment is actually doing nothing?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a terrible career strategy, or, at the very least, a fast track to getting fired.
Right. It sounds completely impossible because, like, we live in a world that fundamentally worships the grind.
Oh, absolutely.
Hustle culture, constant optimization, aggressively forcing outcomes that is the water we swim in.
Yeah.
If there's a problem, the modern instinct is to attack it with more energy, more money, just more force.
Yeah, throw more at it.
Exactly. But what if that obsession with forcing it is actually our greatest vulnerability?
And that is exactly what makes today's depth dive so incredibly compelling, because we're looking at a really bizarre collision of sources today.
Very bizarre.
Right. On one side of the table, we have 2,500-year-old Taoist philosophy. We're talking about granular textual analyses of the ancient Godian-Chu bamboo slips.
Which are literally ancient artifacts.
Yes. And the Mawangdui silk texts. But on the other side of the table, we're pairing those ancient artifacts with highly modern academic research.
Which is such a wild contrast.
It really is. Specifically, we're looking at a 2026 PLOS-1 study analyzing corporate carbon emissions alongside some advanced frameworks for systemic sustainability in modern business.
Seeing ancient bamboo slips lined up next to 2026 corporate sustainability data is just wild. But the mission of this deep dive is to see if we can decode the source code of Taoism.
Right.
We want to figure out how these concepts from ancient thinkers like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi aren't just, mystical poetry. They're actually battle-tested, highly practical strategies.
Yeah, strategies for modern leadership, for navigating complex systems, and honestly, just for preserving your own mental health.
Totally. To do that, though, we kind of have to start by clearing the deck, because our modern vocabulary is actually a massive barrier to understanding these ancient texts.
It is. When we try to read them through a 21st century lens, we completely miss the point. Take the concept of nature, for example. When you hear the word nature today, what comes to mind?
I mean, trees, rivers, mountains, national parks, maybe saving the whales or reducing my carbon footprint.
Right, we immediately think of the biological environment. But when Taoism speaks of nature, the Chinese term is ziran, it doesn't mean the woods outside your house.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it literally translates to self-so, or naturally occurring.
Self-so, huh? That's a really interesting phrase.
Isn't it? It refers to the intrinsic, spontaneous condition of things as they are, without any external interference or, artificial control.
Right.
And the central concept of Taoism, the Tao, follows this intrinsic nature. It's the underlying rhythm of reality, the independent, unchanging origin of all things.
And the sources show that scholars are still, actively debating how to even translate this stuff. There's a fascinating philological detail in the research regarding chapter 25 of the Tao Te Ching.
Yes, the debate over the placeholder name. So Lao Tzu famously says the Tao is unnameable, right? It's beyond human language.
But he has to call it something.
Exactly. He has to give it a placeholder so his students can actually talk about it. And scholars comparing our modern standard texts with those ancient Guodian bamboo slips are arguing over the exact character Lao Tzu originally used.
Is the debate between, two entirely different words?
Well, it's between two characters that sound the same. They're both pronounced da, but they have profoundly different implications.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, one character translates to great, the other translates to reach or pass through.
Wow, okay. Because if the placeholder is just great, it kind of conjures up an image of a giant monument.
Right, like something static.
Exactly. Immovable, impressive, a big object you just stand in front of.
But if the original character actually implied reaching or passing through, that completely shifts the paradigm. It reveals the Tao not as an object, but as a fluid pathway.
It implies constant motion.
Yes. Permeability, continuous connection. It's an active process, not a static thing.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because if you're listening to this and you're trying to manage a team or build a career or get a startup off the ground, this sounds a bit concerning.
How so?
Well, if the ultimate truth is just a fluid pathway of letting things be naturally self-so, isn't that just a philosophical excuse for apathy? Is this just being a lazy gardener who lets the weeds completely overrun the vegetable patch, throws their hands up and says, hey man, that's just nature?
That is the #1 misconception of Taoism, by far. And it brings us to the core concept we really need to unpack today, which is wu-wei.
Wu Wei.
Yeah, it's frequently and poorly translated as non-action, which, yes, sounds like sitting on the couch doing absolutely nothing while your garden dies,
Right.
but a much more accurate translation from the academic literature is non-coercive action.
Non-coercive action. Okay, so you're still acting, you're still doing something, but you aren't forcing an unnatural outcome.
Precisely. You are avoiding action that goes against the grain of reality. There's a really vivid example from the textual sources that perfectly illustrates what Wu Wei is not.
What's the example?
The text warns against trying to dry a well with fire or route the Huai River up a mountain.
Well, yeah, trying to route a river up a mountain sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And, frankly, literally impossible.
Exactly. That is coercive action. That is forcing it. Wu Wei means you don't waste your limited energy on impossible, unnatural tasks.
You don't fight gravity.
Right. Instead, you use resonance. You align your actions with the natural momentum of the system you're already in.
I can see that in the modern business world so clearly. Like, routing a river up a mountain in 2026 looks like spending $50 million on PR and marketing to convince people they desperately need a product they actually hate.
Oh, completely.
You are fighting the natural current of the market, whereas Wu Wei would be simply creating a product that naturally solves a friction point people already have. The current just does the work for you.
That's a perfect modern analogy. It's about catching the current and steering with tiny, effortless adjustments rather than paddling upstream in a hurricane.
Okay, I buy the theory. But modern corporations are practically built on the idea of routing rivers up mountains. They love brute force control.
They really do.
So what actually happens when massive institutions try to apply this concept of resonance?
This is where we look at the modern studies from the sources, specifically those papers from PLOS1 and Empirical Economics. They examined listed companies in China and found that local religious culture, specifically the presence of Taoism and Buddhism, acts as a powerful informal institution.
The data on this is wild, by the way.
It really is.
Where this cultural philosophy is deeply rooted, these massive companies have significantly lower corporate carbon outputs. They also pay remarkably lower pollutant discharge fees.
And it holds true across state-owned enterprises, capital-intensive firms, tech companies.
The numbers are incredibly robust. But the really important question is the why, right? Like, how does a 2,500-year-old philosophy practically reduce carbon emissions in a 21st century manufacturing plant?
Right. It's not like the board of directors are just sitting around meditating the carbon away.
No, obviously not. So what is the actual lever being pulled here?
The researchers map it to something called the Deep and Shallow Sustainability Intervention Framework, or DSSI for short.
Okay.
The fundamental idea is that to fix a massive, complex global problem like climate change, we cannot rely on shallow interventions.
What does a shallow intervention look like in this context?
A shallow intervention is purely technical. It's buying carbon offsets so you can just keep polluting. It's installing a slightly better filter on a smokestack without changing the fact that the factory is actively poisoning the local river.
Yeah.
You're still treating the environment as something completely separate from the company, something to be managed and controlled.
So a shallow intervention is still trying to force a result. It's still coercive.
Exactly. To achieve deep sustainability, the DSSI framework says you have to engage in pre-paradigmatic metacognition.
Wow. That is quite the academic mouthful.
I know, it's a lot. But it essentially means you have to fundamentally change the source code of how you think before you even attempt to solve the problem.
So changing the underlying mindset.
Right. Instead of approaching nature with a mindset of forced extraction and asking, how can we pull the most value out of this land at the lowest cost? The Taoist mindset approaches the system with profound humility.
Because in that worldview, the company and the environment are not two separate things. They're one interconnected body.
Yes. If you harm the environment, you are literally harming yourself. It's an act of self-mutilation. So a deep intervention changes the entire paradigm.
How does that look in practice?
Well, a Taoist-influenced company might redesign its entire supply chain so that the waste from one manufacturing process naturally becomes the fuel for another, mimicking a natural ecosystem.
Oh, that's brilliant.
They stop trying to conquer the environment and start trying to resonate with it.
You know, this obsession with conquering the environment stems from the exact same human impulse as conquering a neighboring country. It's that desire for brute force dominance.
Yes.
And Lao Tzu saw this exact same destructive impulse happening in his own time, just applied to warfare instead of corporate emissions.
Because he lived during a period of brutal, constant conflict, and he was fiercely anti-war. He viewed military aggression as the ultimate expression of coercive action.
The ultimate unnatural disruption of the Tao.
Precisely.
The sources mention this incredible piece of advice Lao Tzu gives about the military. He calls weapons instruments of ill omen. He says that a nation's sharp weapons should not be easily shown to others.
He uses a very specific metaphor for this, actually. He compares a nation showing off its military might to a fish leaving the deep water.
Which is such a vivid image. Because if you expose your weapons, if you're constantly flexing your military muscle or your corporate muscle, for that matter, you're just making yourself vulnerable.
Exactly.
A fish on dry land might look scary for a second while it thrashes around, but it has completely lost its foundational strength. It is totally exposed.
It's a strategy of non-display. But, that naturally raises a huge question for anyone trying to navigate the modern world.
Yeah.
If you aren't flexing your muscles, if you aren't showing off your sharp weapons to intimidate your rivals, how do you actually survive?
Yeah.
Especially in highly competitive environments.
Right. If you are practicing this strategy of resonance and non-coercion, how do you win?
The ancient texts provide what might be the most brilliant physical metaphor in philosophy to answer that. And it's water.
Water.
The highest good is like water. That's from chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching.
Water benefits all things, but does not compete with them. It willingly flows to the low places that everyone else hates.
Think about the strategic advantage of that softness. In chapter 66, Lao Tzu points out that rivers and seas are the kings of 100 valleys. Why are they the kings?
Because they intentionally stay below the valleys.
Yes, gravity does the work for them. Everything naturally flows down to the sea. The sea doesn't have to launch a military campaign to collect the water from the mountains. Its low position absolutely guarantees it.
That's amazing.
This is the strategy of guarding the soft, or shoru. If a leader wants to govern effectively, they must put their own interests behind the interests of the people.
Right.
By placing themselves below and behind, the people don't feel oppressed, they don't feel coerced, and therefore they don't rebel.
Because the leader does not compete in the traditional sense, no one in the world can actually compete with them.
Exactly.
It's realizing that water might feel soft to the touch, but over enough time, it carves the Grand Canyon out of solid rock. The softest thing overcomes the hardest thing.
But think about how that translates to the modern corporate ladder.
I was just going to say, because if you act like water at a modern tech company or a law firm, and you constantly flow to the bottom, and you put everyone else's interest ahead of your own, aren't you just going to get stepped on?
Yeah, doesn't it just turn you into a doormat?
Exactly. Doesn't guarding the soft just make you an easy target?
That is the immediate fear. But this is where the philosophy offers a brilliant pivot to protect you. It introduces the concept of zizibudai,
Zizibudai.
which means knowing when to stop prevents danger.
Knowing when to stop.
To survive without being crushed by the ambition of others, you have to fundamentally redefine what you are actually competing for.
Okay.
If your goal is endless growth, endless prestige, a bigger title, a bigger house, you will always be in danger.
Because you're playing a game that has no finish line. There's always someone with more money or a flashier title who is willing to play dirtier to get ahead of you.
Precisely. So to cure that anxiety, the sources share a fantastic analogy from Zhuangzi, another foundational Taoist thinker. He observes nature and says, a tailor bird nesting in a deep forest only needs one single branch. A mole drinking from the river only needs enough to fill its tiny belly.
I love that. The mole doesn't stand on the riverbank looking at millions of gallons of water, having a panic attack thinking, I need to own all of this river. I need to dam it up and hoard it so the other moles know how successful I am.
No, it just takes a sip and goes about its day, realizing you don't need the whole river cures the anxiety of endless competition.
That is so freeing.
You only get stepped on if you are desperately lying on the stairs trying to block everyone else from climbing to the top.
Wow.
If you realize you don't even want what is at the top of those stairs and you step off the staircase entirely to find your one branch in the deep forest, you become untouchable.
You completely opt out of the coercive game.
You are practicing the wisdom of water. You're flowing around the obstacle instead of trying to smash through it.
So we've talked about the macro level, how this mindset reduces corporate carbon footprints and prevents warfare.
Right.
And we've talked about the interpersonal level, how stepping off the competitive staircase protects you from getting crushed.
Right.
But I want to take this all the way down to the absolute micro level, the internal self.
How do we manage our own minds using this?
Yes, because I can understand how a CEO could adopt this philosophy over a 10-year sustainability plan. But applying this to my own brain when I'm stressed out, facing a deadline, and doom scrolling at 2 a.m.,
Oh, yeah.
that feels entirely different.
The sources address that exact feeling through a concept called Taoist inner alchemy, or Dan Dao. And there's a profoundly deep mental model here. Ruling the body is like ruling the state.
Oh, wow. So your internal self is its own country.
Yes.
Yeah.
In this philosophy, your internal essence, your fundamental vitality and physical health represents the citizens of your internal state.
Okay.
And your spirit and energy represent the state's wealth and resources.
So if I apply the logic we discussed earlier about coercive action, if I am constantly stressed, overworking myself, obsessing over things I can't control, forcing myself to stay awake.
You are launching unnecessary wars. You are acting as a tyrant, overtaxing your own internal citizens.
Oof.
You are draining the wealth of your state to fund endless campaigns of anxiety and desire. And just like a real country, if you tax the citizens too heavily for too long, you cause an internal rebellion.
Your body breaks down. You burn out.
Exact.
That is an incredibly confronting way to look at stress. So how do we stop being a tyrant to our own bodies?
Lao Tzu offers a prescription for this internal tyranny in chapter 67. He calls them the three treasures: mercy, frugality, and not daring to be first in the world.
Frugality is the word that really jumps out there, because usually we think of frugality as like clipping coupons or saving money.
Right.
But in the context of inner alchemy, it's about conserving your mental and spiritual bandwidth.
It is the frugal expenditure of your life force.
You don't spend your limited precious energy on things that simply do not matter. You don't try to dry the well with fire.
Yeah.
You don't rage at the traffic jam, because raging doesn't make the cars move any faster. It just drains your state's treasury.
And by practicing that internal frugality, you build immense reserves of power. You cultivate a state of mental clarity that has birthed idioms we still use in modern Chinese today to describe true mastery.
Oh, like what?
Well, for example, huai ru gu.
What does that translate to?
It means having a mind as open and receptive as an empty valley.
An empty valley.
Yeah. If your mind is completely full of your own ego, your own anxieties, and your preconceived notions, you have no room to receive new information.
Right, you're full.
You can't hear the natural resonance of a situation because you're shouting over it. But an empty valley can receive everything.
And there is another idiom in the research, mu wu quan nu, which comes from what has to be the greatest story in all of these texts.
Ah, the story of Butcher Ding. It literally translates to eyes without a whole cow.
Yeah.
It's from Zhuangzi, and it is the absolute ultimate execution of everything we've discussed today.
The story is that Butcher Ding is tasked with carving up an ox for a ruler. And his movement is so incredibly smooth, so perfectly rhythmic, that it's described as a beautiful, choreographed dance. And the ruler watching him is just astounded and asks how his skill has become so flawless.
And Butcher Ding explains the progression of his mastery. He says that when he first started carving oxen, all he saw was the massive, intimidating whole cow.
Right.
It was a giant problem he had to hack away at. But after 3 years of practice and deeply understanding the Dao, he no longer saw the whole cow.
What did he see instead?
He only saw the natural spaces, the gaps between the joints, the natural separation in the anatomy. He tells the ruler that a good butcher has to change his knife every year because a good butcher cuts.
Okay.
A mediocre butcher has to change his knife every month because a mediocre butcher hacks at the bone.
But Butcher Ding's blade has lasted 19 years. He's carved thousands of oxen, and the edge of his blade looks like it just came fresh off the grindstone.
Because he never hacks at the bone, he never fights the resistance of the animal, he simply guides his incredibly thin blade into the empty spaces that are already there. He uses almost zero physical force, yet the massive ox falls apart perfectly, naturally, right in front of him.
It is action without coercion. It's navigating the immense complexities of the world by finding the path of least resistance, not by applying brute force.
It is the ultimate embodiment of Wu Wei.
What an incredible image to wrap this up on. Let's take a second to recap this journey we've been on, because we have covered massive ground today. We started with ancient bamboo slips buried in tombs and traveled all the way to 2026 frameworks for corporate sustainability and carbon emissions.
We really did. And the logical through line connecting all of it, from preventing climate change to preventing personal burnout, is that this ancient concept of non-coercive action is not about laziness.
Far from it. It's the highly technical application of softness. It's the wisdom of water, flowing to where it can be most effective without fighting gravity.
Exactly.
And it's the preservation of our own internal state by refusing to overtax our own limited energy on unwinnable battles.
We are so conditioned to believe that power means forcing your will upon the world. But these texts prove that true power often looks like stepping back.
Yeah.
It looks like taking your ego out of the equation. Whether you are managing a global supply chain, launching a massive creative project, or just trying to protect your own mental health on a chaotic Tuesday, the greatest tool you have at your disposal is resonance, not control.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Think about a current conflict, a bottleneck, or some overwhelming goal in your life right now that is causing you stress.
Hmm.
Are you currently trying to route a river up a mountain by forcing it?
Think about it.
What would actually happen tomorrow if you stopped hacking at the bone and stopped forcing your will against the reality of the situation and instead just looked for the empty space to slide your blade through?
It requires letting go of the illusion that we can control everything. But as the texts remind us, the softest things in the world will always overcome the hardest rocks.
It turns out, if you want to be truly effective in a world obsessed with doing everything, the ultimate secret might just be learning the power of doing nothing.